días a todos y todas. Para la maestría en Derecho Internacional Económico es un honor tener esta primera masterclass o clase abierta en línea con el profesor, el doctor Suresh Nanwani, profesor de la School of Government and International Affairs de la Durham University del Reino Unido. El profesor Nanwani tiene más de 30 años de experiencia trabajando en desarrollo en organizaciones internacionales como el Banco Mundial y también ha sido anteriormente consejero para el Banco Europeo para la Reconstrucción y el Desarrollo y también asesor en el Banco de Desarrollo de Asia. Es también profesor visitante de la Universidad de South Wales, es un investigador honorario de la Birkbeck University en London, también es miembro de la barra de practicantes de la Global Policy del Reino Unido y también es del Peer Review Journal. También ha sido es miembro ejecutivo de la Sociedad Internacional de Derecho Económico Internacional. También es miembro del Consejo de la International Community Law Review y también es consejero de la barra de la African International Economic Law Network. Por todo eso, muchas gracias al profesor Nanwani por estar con nosotros. Dado el formato del masterclass, les pedimos a ustedes que o bien hagan sus preguntas por escrito o las guarden hasta el final de la exposición. Saying this, thank you, Professor Nanwani, to be here with us. I let you the floor for the masterclass. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. I really appreciate that. And I wish to thank each and every one of you, the participants, and also to Victor for organizing this masterclass. It is my honor to present this masterclass, and the topic, as you know, is anti-corruption, position and steps taken by international financial institutions, called IFIs for short. So this is about an hour session. And what I propose to do is just skip through the speaker part because he's just read it out, Professor Victor Sacco, and he's the coordinator here. And this is just in brief, my topic for today, which I understand has been sent to all the participants. And this is my topic, which is anti-corruption, position and steps taken by international financial institutions. I'm focusing on IFIs. I'm looking at special officers to handle anti-corruption matters. I want to have a look at how IFIs have worked on this matter, which is through statements, joint agreements, and it goes back for since 2006, and the prohibited practices. And I want to focus on a project where there was evidence of corruption, and the result of the investigation made by the project financiers, especially the World Bank, was the World Bank terminated the legal agreements and the project no longer took place as financed by the World Bank and other IFIs. I also want to look at IDB's vision of February 2021, that's Inter-American Development Bank, and its reference to corruption. I propose to discuss, and I've just thrown there a couple of bullets there that you might want to think about on why IFIs take a strong position on anti-corruption measures. What do you think of a speech from the World Bank's president, James Wolfenson, that there is a cancer of corruption, and what do you think IFIs can do, and what do you think are the consequences of loan cancellation? So it's going to be a interactive discussion, but what I propose to do is just to go through briefly here. If you give me about half an hour, and then it'll be open to the floor. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, please roll them in, put them in chat, and Victor has agreed to look at them and put them forward to me. And I can then I see someone's entering, Jesse, at the waiting room, and Victor will go through those questions, and then I will be very happy to answer questions that are being put in the chat or that are being raised later on. So without further ado, I will proceed with the topic. Now, IFIs that I'm talking about in dealing with anti-corruption are the World Bank, Regional Development Banks, IFC/MEGA. World Bank, as we all know, is the bank that constitutes two entities, IBRD, that's International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and its concessional lending window called International Development Association. And for regional development banks, this is referring to the 4 regional development banks, which are 1, Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, 2nd, African Development Bank, 3rd, Asian Development Bank, and the 4th is European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And then I talk of IFC-MEGA, which is part of the World Bank Group. World Bank Group is an entity that consists of the World Bank, which is 2 banks, 2 banks, which is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, International Development Association, which is the concessional lending window. The 3rd one is IFC, which is for private sector, International Finance Corporation. The 4th is MEGA, which is Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. And the 5th is ICSID, ICSID, International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. So these are the IFIs that I'm covering here. They do include others, of course. So you might see later on, I would refer to a bank called, Islamic Development Bank. That's also a IFI. Now, let me start off by saying that before, I have my experience in working with working in IFIs. And, you know, when I joined in the late 1980s, the word anti-corruption was not used formally. In fact, anti-corruption or corruption was, as a policy, came up in the 90s in the IFIs, starting with the World Bank, and then other IFIs followed suit and incorporated and had policies enunciated on corruption. Of course, it doesn't mean that there was no corruption before. It's been there, you know, we all know it. It's just that it's part of everyday life in a way. Sometimes we see it, sometimes we look at it in the face. We know it's happening in our daily lives. But what I want to focus on is, insofar as IFIs are concerned, how do they address corrupt activities? And when I say corrupt activities, I'm talking of projects that IFIs are doing in the sense of lending, and how they address corrupt activities. So they handle allegations of fraud and corruption by having special officers. As I mentioned, prior to 1990, you didn't have those special officers, but when the policies got into place, like for example, in Asian Development Bank in 95, 97, in the World Bank as well, then you actually had officers being established. So when you had officers being established, it becomes part of the institutional culture that you actually have a governance structure whereby fraud and corruption would be looked at. So you had the World Bank having Department of Institutional Integrity, INT, IDB, Inter-American Development Bank having its Office of Institutional Integrity, Asian Development Bank Office of Anti-Corruption and Integrity, OAI, and EBRD, Office of Chief Compliance Office, OCCO. You know, they come in different names, different dressing, but you know, it's still the same. The material is the same. And if you look at one thing that stands out is basically integrity. The word integrity stands out. And integrity is a buzzword because it can mean so many things. So you can see it's INT for the World Bank, institutional integrity for IDB, integrity for ADB, and EBRD having Office of Chief Compliance Office. And then now you have, in 2006, you have a joint IFI statement where the heads of IFIs, including ADB, AFDB, EBRD, IDB, and the World Bank, they issued a joint statement which agreed on a uniform framework of preventing and combating fraud and corruption in the activities and operations of the institutions. So very clear activities and operations of these institutions, which would cover projects. And then this framework builds on the work, a joint task force, which was established in 2006 by the leaders of these institutions. And then you had in 2010, a joint agreement to cross-debar firms and individuals. Let me explain this. So what you had was an agreement by these institutions to cross-debar firms and individuals found to have engaged in prohibited practices in MDB finance development projects. MDB would mean Multilateral Development Bank. So World Bank is MDB, Inter-American Development Bank is an MDB. The ones that I've cited earlier on, they're all MDBs, Multilateral Development Bank, as opposed to say bilateral, development, bilateral bank. So they agreed on mutual enforcement of debarment decisions to enforce each other debarment's actions on a prospective basis with regards to prohibited activities. And the prohibited activities are four. One is corruption. And then you've got fraud. That's what we always see when we talk of corruption. Corruption, fraud. And then you have one called coercion. And then you've got the fourth one called collusion. So, you know, these are very specific references, very specific definitions. And it's called cross-debarment, which means, so for example, if I am from, say, EBRD, I've bid for a contract or a consulting assignment in EBRD, and I'm found by OCO, which I mentioned is the department concerned, to have engaged in corrupt activity. I would be given a sanction. And then if I want to go to Inter-American Development Bank and bid for a contract, I can't because there is cross-debarment. So my being found sanctioned by EBRD will prevent me from placing a bid or a consulting assignment for Inter-American Bank. Likewise, I cannot also apply and bid for World Bank projects. Likewise, I cannot also apply and bid for African Development Bank projects. It is cross-debarment, So if I'm affected by one institution, these institutions that have entered into a framework agreement, they cross-debar. So it is actually a very powerful tool because it means that if an individual or firm is debarred and publicized by any one of these institutions, the other institutions will cross-debar that person or firm, and they cannot participate in projects or activities financed by that institution or the other institutions for the applicable sanction period. So the sanction period can be, it depends what it is. It could be 1 month, it could be permanent. There's a whole spectrum. It depends on the kind of corrupt practice that took place, and that's up. So there's obviously a matching list to make sure that it is governed by a agreement that they roughly know, the institutions know, this is what they do. So there's harmonization. They want to apply consistency, and they do that. Yeah. And now I want to go into the documents here just to give you a feel of what I've mentioned. So when we have here the agreement for mutual enforcement of debarment, you would here, you would see that, okay, you have the African Development Bank Group, Asian Development Bank, EBRD, Inter-American Development Bank, and World Bank Group. So if you look down at this, this is the one where they talk of the debarment period, and then you have the signature by all these institutions: African Development Bank Group, Asian Development Bank, EBRD, IADB Bank Group, and World Bank Group. Now, IADB Bank Group, I highlight this because this is Inter-American Development Bank Group. It's IADB and the private sector arm called IDB Invest. So they have actually agreed and they sign off together. So when you get world leaders of these IFIs actually signing off on this, it shows that these institutions are very strong, and they want to share their knowledge to make sure that they work together. And this is the one that they work together: fraudulent practice, corrupt practice, coercive practice, collusive practice. And these are precise definitions that are defined in the uniform framework. Then I want to go now to the part where I mentioned here, which is on the Padma Multipurpose Bridge project. This is an interesting project in the sense that it was funded by various institutions, including the World Bank and ADB. And then it was approved by the World Bank, IDA. IDA, if you remember, I mentioned, is the International Development Association, the concessional lending window, which means it's for very poor countries. And that means they usually land at, like 1% service charge, that kind of thing. It's not like with a higher rate that they would do under the ordinary lending by IBRD. It's concessional lending for very poor countries, and it was approved also by ADB. But after approval, there was credit cancellation. Credit because in IDA, when they lend, they call their loans credits. So there was this cancellation by the World Bank, and in turn by other financiers such as ADB. There were also other financiers. One was JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, which lent $400 million, 140 from Islamic Development Bank. So if you look at that whole project, it's a very big amount because the project itself cost, let me just adjust the screen. The project itself cost, $2,915 million, of which 1,200 million was from IDA. That's the concessional lending window from the World Bank. 615 million from Asian Development Bank. 400 million from JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. 140 million from Islamic Development Bank, and a government contribution of 560 million. The dollar amounts here refer to US dollars. The project was approved by the World Bank in February 2011, but after evidence of corruption came to light and no remedy was put forward by the government, the World Bank terminated the legal agreements in 2012. And likewise, what happened at the other institutions, they terminated their legal agreements as well. So the result was there was no project financing by these institutions. It's actually the first time ever that a project has gone to fruition from a project cycle. Project cycle is, when you do a project, like in this case, a multi-purpose bridge project. So basically this project, let me just explain, this is in Bangladesh. I'm not sure if you are familiar with Bangladesh in South Asia, but there's a huge river called the Padma River, and it sort of runs through the country all the way down and into the Dhaka. Then from Dhaka, that's the capital city, it goes all the way down to the Delta and then to the Bay of Bengal. So you have the east and west part divided by this river, and there was this multi-purpose bridge that was going to connect the two parts of the country, and it would have been very of economic benefit to the country in terms of development potential, economic financing. However, there was evidence of corruption. Now, I don't want to go into the details because you can see it in the slide that I'm going to pick up in the reference. There was an issue that came to light to the World Bank authorities, and they wanted clarification. They needed to check with the government, because at this point of time, it's very clear that any kind of activity needs that where there's evidence of corruption, there needs to be investigation. So in this case, what the government did, what the banks did, was to ask the government authorities, look, we need to find out certain issues, and no remedy came to light. Let's just look at what happened here. This is the World Bank communication. So there was a World Bank communication that the World Bank presented evidence of corruption to the government of Bangladesh in September 2011 and April 2012. The World Bank has an obligation to maintain confidentiality of referral reports. And then the World Bank suggested that the government meaning government of Bangladesh, adopt 4 measures, but the government was only able to adopt 2. It was unable to commit to 2 of the 4. So there was an anti-corruption commission, and it was agreed. Then the government accepted alternative project implementation arrangement, but the government would not accept the other 2. Where it was asked to provide information, allowing panel to assess the adequacy of the investigative process. And then the government also was unwilling to exclude public officials from public service for the duration of the investigation. So the World Bank was unable to reach agreement on 2 of the 4, and it was left with no option but to cancel its support for the bridge, meaning the project. It does take time. So this, if you can see, it brought it attention in September 2011. And if you remember, the legal agreements were canceled in June 2012. So it's like 9 months that I can see there. And actually it's not something that you would do it straight away. You would want to look at it, be very careful. And the reason is because Bangladesh is a member of the World Bank. It's a development partner. So I think it raises a lot of questions like, how does this really pan out? What's going to happen for other projects that Bangladesh has with the World Bank? So it really has a very daunting effect, because you remember I mentioned to you about the project cycle. Projects don't just happen and get created overnight. They take time to germinate. They go through a cycle. And when they go through a cycle, which is like that, you have the country partnership strategy, then you have the design, the feasibility study. Then after the feasibility study, you then have appraisal, then you have documents to negotiate the report that goes to the board of directors, and then you have the loan agreement, the negotiations, the signing, board approval, which take place before that, and then you have the project implementation. After the project implementation, then you have completion, and then the last one is evaluation. So you have project, country partnership strategy, and then you've got the feasibility study, then you have the design, and then you have the appraisal. After appraisal, you then have the report, and then you have the loan agreement, and then you have the board negotiations, then the board of directors approves it, then you have the signing, then you have the implementation, then you have the completion, and then you have the evaluation. So it's a very long process. In fact, in this case, I think they actually took about 10 years to even come up with the, for the project to go up to the board of directors for approval. And lots of money would have been spent because, you know, there's lots of feasibility to be done, etc. So it's really quite a lot of money was put into that. Think of all the staff that was, you know, who were engaged in the process as well. Yeah. So, and this is the credit that I'm talking about, the World Bank credit, meaning the IDA credit. So the credit is concessional, it is interest-free. So you do get a credit of a service charge of 0.75%, which is really nothing much at all. And there's a longer repayment period of 40 years and 10-year grace period. And then what has happened here? The World Bank has an obligation to ensure its fund reaches the intended beneficiaries. And in this case, it really was very chilling, the effect, right? Because you had other IFIs that followed suit as well. And would it affect the other projects that the World Bank has with Bangladesh? Would it affect also other projects, say, that ADB has with Bangladesh? Would it also affect other projects that IDB, Islamic Development Bank, would have with Bangladesh? We can discuss that later on, but the answer is no, because those projects still go on. But of course, you can actually see the effects, because now when these institutions engage with the country, they would be more circumspect, they would have increased, or what you call greater oversight, yeah? And it's all in the name of good governance, yeah? So I want to now then go to another slide here where I think would be useful. This is from an agreement that I picked out from Asian Development Bank. So this is a kind of loan covenant as a condition. The borrower, in this case, is a public document, so I'm just showing it here. The borrower here would be Sri Lanka. So let me just go up for you to have it's a loan agreement in a Southern Transport Development Project between Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka and Asian Development Bank, 2008. So I'm going back now to the Schedule 5, which is the loan covenants here. And I'm looking now at paragraph 9. The borrower, which is Sri Lanka, shall ensure that all contracts financed by the bank in connection with the project, they have provisions specifying ADB to audit and examine the records and accounts of, this is the Ministry of Highways, Road Development Authority, and all contractors, suppliers, consultants. Now, this is the part that I really want to look at, paragraph 10. So borrower shall cause RDA, that's the Road Development Authority, to disclose contract awards at RDA website within 7 working days of the award of contract, and then undertake necessary measures to create and sustain a corruption-free environment. Ensure that the borrower's anti-corruption law and ADB's anti-corruption policy 1998 as amended to date, are strictly enforced and complied with. So you can see the wording of the covenant. It's not just a blanket covenant where you say the borrower shall comply with the bank's anti-corruption policy. It is the borrower shall cause RDA to disclose contract awards on RDA's website within 7 working days on the award of contract. There's a lot of meat there to make it more telling in the sense of how ADB wants to enforce or ensure that there's an anti-corruption environment. It depends. So if you're a lawyer, you could draft something like that. But if you did draft something like that, you need to be very clear why you're drafting that. Some institutions, including ADB, might have a general covenant. Sometimes it becomes very specific. I wanted to just show this to you because it shows that institutions are very serious about it. So I'll go back here to the slide here. I was talking of IDB's vision. So, you know, in Inter-American Development Bank, it's focusing on LAC region, which is the Latin American and Caribbean region. So this is very interesting. It actually says in page 2 of the vision document that the LAC region performs poorly in terms of implementing rule of law and controlling corruption. And according to the World Economic Forum's Global Competitive Index for 2017-18, corruption is one of the main factors affecting the region's business climate, together with government bureaucracy. So I think it's kind of telling. I had actually given a lecture earlier on to this university, and I had singled out a justice project in Peru, where again, in one of the project components, there was address made for corruption. So I end on this note in the sense that, just to sum it up, IFIs, the institutions concerned, World Bank, regional development banks, which would include IADB, and then I talked of special officers that are created, and then the IFI, joint IFI statement, the joint agreement to cross-debar firms and individuals, prohibited practices, of which there are 4, corruption, fraud, coercion, and collusion. I single out a Padma multi-purpose bridge project to show the extent that institutions come together and actually the end result is withdrawing from the project, canceling the project itself. And then I brought more to home ground on IDB's vision, because it does show that corruption is a problem or has to be addressed in the context of IDB, just as it has to be addressed in any other institution. So when I talk of the discussion here, what are the reasons for taking a strong position? I'm opening it to the floor, and I just want to highlight when in James Wolfenson, who was probably the first person who, you know, uttered this. It's just amazing. He set up an anti-corruption task force, and his famous speech, "And let's not mince words, we need to deal with the cancer of corruption." Wow. You know, can you imagine someone saying that? Let's not mince words, we need to deal with the cancer of corruption. It's so chilling. I still, whenever I think about it, my goodness, you know, it gave me a lot to think about when I joined in the 1980s and in the 1990s. And then, of course, you actually have covenants on anti-corruption. It just makes you realize, wow, things have changed. You can actually talk about it, where before it was just silence or it doesn't exist. Now you actually put it in word form, in loan agreements, in the reports, you say it. You even have leaders signing agreements on referring to corruption, referring to the 4 prohibited practices. Very strong. And of course, I want now to bring to 2020 context, 2021. Very important, because you've seen this IDB's vision, February 2021, corruption being mentioned. In fact, now with COVID, you have probably got more reason. Are we sure that there's an anti-corruption environment around, because that really needs to be ensured that there shouldn't be corruption. So if you look at the papers, wherever it may be, you would see references to corruption or allegations. You see how much this is so topical now that 30 years ago, you know, institutions would fight shy of using that term, but now it's part of the institutional policy. And these are the references I made here. And I added a third one, which was the covenant that I had from a loan agreement by an IFI. I end at this note and I open it to the floor. So Victor, you can roll the questions in, or you know, or any person can just raise a question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Nanwani. So we open the floor. Podemos coger preguntas. Si hay preguntas en castellano por escrito, las podemos traducir también.
If anyone has a question, please don't hesitate to ask. This is a good time to ask anything that you just want to clear up, either what I've said or your viewpoint, or if you look at the discussion points, what do you want to add, or what do you think of those questions or those discussion points that I've raised? Do you think IFIs can take other measures that you think would be useful? You know, it's always open to discussion. And I think when you think about it, that's really good, because think of how you would want to address, if you, as a student, as a member of the public, how would you want to address if you were a financier, or if you were a project recipient, you know? Because when there's corruption, who stands to lose? I don't want to answer the question. I'll answer it only if I have to. Who stands to lose if there's corruption in a IFI project? Maybe I can ask that question, but I wait for your questions, for your comments. Who do you think stands to lose if there's corruption in a project?
Well, if I may, at the end is all the population of the country that has contributed to the project or wanted to benefit from it.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. You're right, Victor. You know, the project. So in this case, you know, the Bangladesh project, or in the ADB project, the Bangladesh project, which was funded by World Bank and other institutions. The ones who would have benefited from the project would be the people, right? Those who would stand to gain from having this bridge project, the multi-purpose project, so economic development could take place. They were the beneficiaries, yeah, which is basically the whole lot of the population. And they stand to lose, right? Because now there's no project. The project has been withdrawn. So if you think about it, it's their loss. And then if you think of the ADB with Sri Lanka, the highway project, similar situation as well. Those who are benefiting from the use of the highway, anyone who benefits in an indirect way as well. So it's the people, it's the people. And when I say the people, you know, you put it in a wider plate, it's the taxpayers, right? Who funds when the country has to repay the loan, where the funds coming from? The funds come from the taxpayers' money, basically. It's the taxpayers who are contributing, and that's how the loans get repaid. So they stand to lose as well. And actually, that's why I think, you know, corruption is cancerous in that sense, because it's, you know, it raises integrity issues here. Because yes, a few might have benefited, and I use the word benefited in a way that not to suggest there's a good aspect to that, but it's actually wrong. It's you depriving the benefit to the country, to the people, and they suffer because they are made to pay for it, the corruption that has happened. And I think this is the sad part about it, because even now in the COVID times, when one hears about why some, you know, PPEs or, you know, mask or whatever, that there's some corrupt activity taking place, it's sad, right? It's terrible, because it reflects on the economy. It reflects on why some are doing it like this. People have to pay more when they would have to pay less for the item in question. So I think this is something that corruption is certainly is a word that, you know, has to be looked at squarely and say, look, we must deal with it. And that's why when I say we must deal with it, it comes up with those agreements by the IFIs, because they, in the name of, you know, the Accra Agenda for Action or Paris Declaration, you have harmonization of activities where they harmonize the activities. They even harmonize the definitions so that, you know, corruption, fraud, coercion, collusion, they are very precise meanings, because they are all referred to and defined what they specifically mean. So you actually have harmonization, and that's great, because otherwise would this have happened? I don't think so. It would not have happened. So this is the forum where this has actually happened, where IFIs harmonize their activities and are on the same page on this.
I think we have a question from, we have a question from Natalia. She's asking if she understood well, and the Padma Bridge project was the first corruption case that you mentioned.
Padma Bridge project was the first corruption case. Is that what?
Yeah, the question is, yeah, if Padma was the first corruption case.
No, it's not. There are actually many corruption cases, but you know, when I say corruption cases, what do I mean by it? It was the first project that actually got cancelled because of evidence of corruption coming to light. And when the government was asked to address the corruption allegations, it couldn't, to the satisfaction of World Bank, and the result was the World Bank terminated the agreements in 2012 June. So you remember in the slide I had earlier on, I said it came up in September 2011, and then so that's about 9 months. In June 2012, everything got washed off to say, okay, we're going to terminate. We're not going to carry on with this project. So in a way, it was good that the funds hadn't been dispersed, yeah? The funds had not been dispersed. Do you remember I mentioned the project cycle, yeah? So you have the country partnership strategy, then when the board of directors approved the loan, and then you have the loan signing, and then you have the project implementation. In this case, the project hadn't been implemented. So the project's agreement, the legal agreements got terminated. So the project had not carried on in terms of implementation. So I think in a way that was good, because if the funds had gone through, you know, it would have been other issues raised, yeah? So typically, and I'm just going a bit out of line here. So sometimes if there is an evidence that there is corruption, the bank would have a number of measures that it could take. It could tell, it depends on who is doing it. So if it's we're looking here from the perspective of the borrower and from the perspective of the person who's placed a bid. So it could be a firm, it could be an individual, it could be a company for consulting assignment or civil works contract. If they found to have engaged in it, then, you know, measures would be taken that they cannot bid for the project and they would have to be debarred, cross-debarred from participating in other IFI projects. If there's evidence that there is corruption and it depends on who it is, the institution would say, okay, what do we do? So sometimes if it's coming from the government side, like, you know, the executing agency official, there would have to be reparation made. If it also could come from the institution side, you know, bank staff could also be found to be corrupt. You know, let's not say that it's always some other side. It could be internal. So if it is internal, the bank, you remember the departments I mentioned here, and I used to work in the, I used to handle some aspects of that. So, you know, it could be for the bank staff, it could mean, you know, measures that the bank could take. It could also result in dismissal. And with the dismissal could also result in, you know, whatever you owe or has to be paid back, has to be paid back. And the result is dismissal. You're out of the bank. Depends on what is the nature of the fraud and corrupt activity, of course. But usually it's one word that I would define it: zero tolerance, okay? Zero tolerance. The banks have a zero tolerance policy. So if a staff is found guilty of fraud and corruption, it's zero tolerance. My experience has shown that to be the case. Zero tolerance. Out they go. So it's not the first, there are many, but this is the first of its kind where the banks withdrew and didn't carry on with the project at all. And the implication is very intense in the sense that it took so long for the banks to come up with this stage, because you remember I mentioned the project cycle, the design and the feasibility study. It took a long time. I mean, imagine 2,915 million is the project cost. It's not something to be sneezed at. So, you know, a lot of money and the time that was spent in the documents. And when I say documents, there were so many issues that had to be raised, which is separate from here, you know, like resettlement issues, environment issues, a lot of feasibility studies that had to be done. How would the bridge be constructed that would be in compliance with the policies of the IFIs on environment, on resettlement, involuntary resettlement, on social dimensions, so many policies, what you call the safeguard policies that the banks have. Thank you, Natalia, for that question. Any other questions? Would you be able to suggest something that, how do you think it is that you would see if you were the bank staff? Or what would you suggest that IFIs can take in their fight against corruption? If you were the president of an IFI, why not? You might be one day. How would you handle it? Or if you were a government officer, how would you handle it? You see, the dynamics are such that, you know, how would you handle it as a person paying taxes, as a government officer responsible for the project, as a bank staff, as a bank IFI, you know, as an IFI leader? You can see, you know, do you share the same platform that corruption is something that has to be nipped? Zero tolerance. Do you think the consequences of loan cancellation, how would it affect the borrower? If you were the borrower, like in this case, Bangladesh, do you think your other projects with the World Bank should also be canceled? Or should they be allowed to go on? What do you think? You're lawyers, or at least I'm sure some of you are lawyers. What do you think? You think it'd be appropriate, or should all the projects that the World Bank with Bangladesh has with Bangladesh should also be canceled? The answer was, it wasn't. The other projects still went on, but there was greater oversight because the other projects are still intact. You don't cancel all projects just because one project has been found to have allegations of corruption that couldn't be resolved, because it raises tricky issues, because Bangladesh is still a member of the World Bank. It still has other projects, and those projects shouldn't be made to suffer. It could be an education project, and that's got no corruption, that's tainted. So why should that project be penalized? So, but you know, it's kind of interesting. If you were in the civil society, you might say, no, you must really punish, and you must do everything that's possible. But is that the right way to do it? Is that how best you want to fight against corruption? If there's anyone who's got any thoughts on this, I'd be very happy to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you. We have a comment here. I think it's also from Natalia. Let me read it. She says that she believes that if the other projects that follow with the steps of the process correctly, they should not have to be canceled, but only sanction those who were involved in corruption with the project.
Yeah, what did she say? I heard the first part, but I didn't get the full thing.
She believes that the other project, if the other project have followed the steps of the process correctly, they should not have to be canceled. Only sanction to the people that didn't comply with the process, or sanction to the projects that didn't comply with the process.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, if you know, so in the case of this Padma Bridge, right? It's a bridge project. It's a multi-purpose bridge. So that whole project got cancelled. But Bangladesh is a borrower of the World Bank for many other projects like education, health, etc. Not just the World Bank, but you know, from Asian Development Bank, from Islamic Development Bank. So what has happened is the other projects, and I just pick out on education, would still go on because that project wasn't the subject of corruption, right? Or I mean, of allegations. It was this particular project that had corruption allegations. So to penalize the country, because and I say the countries because the country is the borrower of the project, yeah? Like the one in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is the borrower of that Southern Transport Development Project. So to penalize the country for other projects like education or health project where there's no allegation of corruption would not be appropriate. However, as I mentioned, it would be appropriate still for the banks, the financing institutions to say, okay, now that we've seen or we've come across allegations of corruption, let us now be a bit more circumspect that when we have lending to the country, we should also check to see how can we be more vigilant that there should be no corruption taking place, because it's just a gut reaction, right? That you want to make sure that you do it properly. So that is why if you look at the World Bank statement that I highlighted earlier on, the World Bank press release in number 2, they said the World Bank would exercise greater oversight. That's quite understandable. So, you know, if you were a project team leader, and then you had to do an education project after the Padma Bridge, you know, people in the bank would be asking you lots of questions. Are you sure your project you've actually made sure that there will be no way that corrupt activities could be practiced, or, you know, that you are making sure that you are foolproofing to make sure that you are working in an environment where it's corruption free? And you have to actually say, yeah, I'm taking measures. So do you remember the covenant, the loan covenant I mentioned earlier on, in this one here, yeah, where you put in a loan covenant to say you disclose award contracts on the website within 7 working days of the award of contract. So, you know, you actually write out these covenants where you think it's appropriate. So, you know, these are ways where you can actually exercise good governance measures, and also in the course of the design, when you are actually working with the government and preparing the project, you can actually discuss, you know, how you want to make sure that there's corrupt-free environment, because it's to the interest of both the lending institution and to the country as well, for the reason that it is the people who are paying for the loan, and they need to be factored in because they're the ones who are actually going to suffer at the end. Absolutely right, yeah.
Well, I think we don't have further questions. So maybe Professor Nanwani, we want to thank you very much for this masterclass. I think you give a lot of food for thoughts for our students and for the people who will watch the video. So thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. And my thanks to you, Victor, and to all those who have been attending this. Thank you for giving me your time and letting me share my thoughts with you on corruption and how IFIs can take steps and measures, and in the context of IDB's vision as well, where corruption is highlighted as an issue to be dealt with in the IDB's vision document. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the very best and in your studies and in your career. Thank you very much. Good day.
Gracias a todos y todas por asistir. Entonces la transmisión termina acá. Que tengan buen día. Hasta luego.
Thank you.